Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Lifetime Legacy Lawyer Podcast. I'm your co-host, Thomas Vick, joined by our co-host, Seth Wilson. Seth, how's it going today?
Thomas, I'm doing great. We actually got some snow here recently, so it's kind of fun to have some color on the ground and get some of those seasons here. Even got to shovel the driveway a little bit. How about you?
Yeah, I've shoveled the driveway twice in 1 week here in the first week of December on the south side of Indianapolis. I think you guys might have gotten a little bit more snow than we did. Something about I-70 in the city of Indianapolis cuts off a lot of the snowfall between the north side and the south side. Yeah, things are going well. We're kind of getting towards the end of the year now. And one of the things that we like to talk about on the Lifetime Legacy Lawyer podcast is leadership in the law firm. You were recently reading a book or listening to a book, I think, or a podcast, I think, by Andy Stanley regarding leadership and leading versus managing. And I kind of wanted to open it up to you and kind of let you have the floor and talk about what you were learning from that podcast.
Yeah, and we'll post a link to that episode in the show notes because it's just an interesting topic. Because I think a lot of times as lawyers, we can get caught into the busyness of the practice and trying to get all of the things done that we need to get done. And obviously that's very important and vital to the success of the law firm because, we've got legal client-based work that we need to do. And so when you're figuring out, especially as a small firm or as a solo lawyer, you have to really understand where you get the most value out of your time. And there's different phrases, I think, that kind of capture this dichotomy between managing the business and leading the business. But I think we've talked about even on the podcast, kind of the good to great mentality of working in your business or working on your business and those kind of things. But I liked this because it kind of helps you take off the doing hat and put on maybe the thinking hat. And when you're leading your firm, thinking through what's the vision for the firm? What's the ideal situation for how we can carry out the tasks that we do in the provision of legal services? And taking a step back from the day-to-day busyness that occurs and figuring out as the attorney or as the leader of the law firm, where is your time best going to be used and how can you structure things in a way that helps leverage your strengths? And there's a lot of hats to wear when you're running and starting a firm, and so that's going to look different at different seasons. I thought that exercise, especially as kind of come up into goal planning season and or reflecting on the past year and seeing how things went, where are those opportunities showing up?
Yeah, and what comes to mind on this topic of leading the law firm rather than managing it is the idea of the more I'm needed in the law firm, the less valuable my law firm is. You really need to have processes and systems in place so that you're not as needed for every little thing. Allows for more time for you to think about marketing and thinking about how to grow the law firm. Because if you're in the day-to-day of you've got client appointments and you've got to actually do the work after getting the client to hire you, if you're doing all of that work, then that's not going to put you in the best position for the next client and then the next client. You really have to have processes in place so that you're able to, get ready for the next client, think about your next move. So that's one thing that I've thought about a lot is the more I'm needed in the law firm, the less valuable my law firm is. So that's kind of my feedback on that.
Yeah, and it's counterintuitive because that's me. I bring that value. I'm the one who has to do that. I'm responsible for it. And so you don't ever abdicate the responsibility, but the concept was mentioned in the podcast of that responsible delegation of how are you making sure that as you're looking at all the different aspects of your practice and the delivery of your service to your client, what's the best way to navigate that and what's the best way to systematize it so it can be repeated and give you those high quality results over and over. And those are the key things, I think, as we're entering into sort of the tail end of the year and reflecting on what worked well and what needed to be improved based on feedback and those kind of things. And then personally, like, what are the things that really only I can do? And how do I move everything else off to someone else to do? And that's not an easy exercise, because I know many lawyers kind of feel that ongoing responsibility for each little aspect of whatever, the deliverable is. And I struggle with that because I never want to ask anybody to do something I'm not willing to do myself.
Right.
But I think one thing Andy Stanley pointed out in the podcast that's helpful is there are things that I don't like to do that somebody else may love to do. And if you can find that support system that works everyone into their area of competence, where maybe that weakness for me is met by someone's strength over here, that's the best outcome you can hope for.
Yeah, a couple of notes that come to mind to me is, you really want to empower your staff to be able to make the decisions that need to be made, that, you give them a direction, and it's going to be the same direction every single time for every single case in that practice area. And one of the areas that I practice in is estate planning. So one thing that has to happen in pretty much every estate planning case is I've got to get a client to fill out a questionnaire. Well, I could be the one to call the clients and ask, hey, have you filled out that questionnaire yet? Or resend the email. Or instead, I can delegate that task to a paralegal, and that is that paralegal's responsibility now to get that questionnaire done. And the questionnaire may be completed, and it may be at a point where I can review it and say, this isn't filled out enough, we need more information. And we tell the paralegal, okay, you go back to the client and you ask for the names and addresses of the client's kids so that we can put that into our system. These are things that are actually very time consuming. Calling a client, having a conversation that may take 10 or 15 minutes. And kind of the frustrating part of law practice can be, I know that that's a 10 or 15 minute conversation, but I really only need about 30 seconds of information from the phone call. And so is it the best use of the attorney's time to make that phone call? Probably not. But then when we were talking about, should you have an irrevocable trust versus a revocable trust, that's an attorney-client conversation that has to happen and that cannot be changed. You have to be the attorney, that you have to be the employee to have that conversation with the client, and you really can't shirk that. I guess that's kind of where I see leadership versus managing the law firm. Somebody that's kind of just managing is just making sure that these tasks are taken care of and handles those tasks by himself and isn't delegating as much as he ought to. I think when you're leading, you're really empowering your team members to understand their responsibility and to be able to act on it. Another thing that comes to mind is, just document gathering. It's kind of parallel to the estate planning questionnaire that we have filled out. But in some of my cases, whether it's estate administrations or it's Medicaid planning, we've got to have documentation of, bank accounts and retirement accounts and things like that. We need to have a listing of real estate. And again, document gathering can be very cumbersome. And that's where you really want to train up your paralegals to understand what they need to get from the client so that you can review the file and have everything there for you. I think that is going to free up a whole lot of time for you if you're able to do that.
Yeah. And it will also help identify what information may also be needed that you get to follow up on. So if the team member who is responsible for that was unable to get a question answered, now you have one thing to do versus 10. And so it's much easier to have that conversation and say, oh, by the way, I still need so-and-so's date of birth, address, what have you. And I think that's one of those things that you start picking up inertia by having things already in process, and it's easier to keep it moving that way. And you're less likely to procrastinate on it because boy, I'm going to have to go through all of these things. But now we've kind of tagged these two things together, and I'm explaining the difference between the different types of trusts, and I'm asking one piece of information. And so my brain goes, hey, I'm good with that. And so I think those are the things that, as you identify in your practice, what is it that only you can do as the lawyer, and what is it that only someone else can do better and more economically for the client and for the firm as a whole, then you start to enjoy what you do a lot more as well. And so kind of benefits everybody around, which is pretty impressive. And I will say this too, as you think about delegation, as you start growing as a firm owner, you're going to potentially hire new lawyers. Anytime you put another lawyer in front of your client, there is risk, because how is that lawyer going to handle situations? How is the client going to react to that? Are you prepared, just from a mental perspective, to say, what happens if it doesn't work out as well as it should have worked out potentially, or didn't go up to your standards? And how are you going to have that conversation with the client? How are you going to work through that? And that's a whole nother level of leading and managing, and trying to figure out, okay, I can't just turn someone loose necessarily without having poured into them and help develop their character and their skill and those types of things to reflect on the culture and the perspective we want to bring in the provision of our services. And so you have to be prepared to trust people. You have to be prepared to clean up mess every once in a while. You have to be prepared to potentially weigh that risk of, boy, if this doesn't work out, what's the downside here? And then work through that and be committed to making sure that you're giving feedback and say, hey, we got this complaint from the client. What do we do with it? How do we navigate it? How can I help you get better through this? How can I learn from it? What are the areas that maybe I could have given better direction or better prep to the client, or what have you? So lots of different things to think about there, but it's certainly not without risk to do delegation. And that's why I think a lot of times we get stuck as lawyers in that management mode rather than getting up into the leading mode.
Yeah, I think that kind of speaks to what I was saying about you've got to empower your team. It could be a paralegal, but it can be associate attorneys that you hire as your firm is growing. And just because they're attorneys doesn't mean that they know everything that you do. You have perhaps several years of being an attorney in front of them, and so you've got that under your belt. And you may have had hundreds and perhaps thousands of conversations with clients. They might have had a few dozen, and there's just a big difference between a few dozen conversations and hundreds of conversations with clients. You get to understand and anticipate how people are going to react to certain difficult conversations that you have. I think that's kind of something that I've learned in my practice. Is I know that it's going to be a hard thing for the client to receive, and so I feel like I'm able to break things more gently to the client, and as a result of that, the client is able to handle the information a little bit better, and just kind of give the client space. I guess that's kind of part of the training, right? Letting people have that experience, but then also giving guidance to your staff about how to handle particular situations. It's kind of hard to believe, but as a small law firm owner myself, it really is about people at this point. For so many years, it's been about just getting the work done. But as the law firm is growing, we're trying to figure out how to best lead and empower people to do as good of a job or better than I've done.
Yeah, and that's also a scary thing as an owner, right? When you realize, boy, these guys are a lot smarter than me, and did I know that much when I came out of school? And, all those kind of, that imposter syndrome can really come in to play. And I think you have to look at what you've done and where you've come from, and realize that you're setting yourself up to be someone that someone wants to work with, both from a client side and from an employee side. And that's a pretty huge responsibility. But if you didn't exude some level of competence, they wouldn't come work with you. Now, you could find somebody that just needs a job or something like that, I suppose. But for the most part, there's some level of this firm knows what they're doing and I want to be a part of what's happening. And that's a good thing. And so it's a lot of fun. It's not for the faint of heart, as we say a lot of times as well, but making those adjustments and reflections to try to figure out in 2026, what are some of the things that I want to change to be even better on that? How can I lead better? How can I manage better? How can I provide more services to my clients in a better way? Lots of fun to think about all of those things. And I know sometimes that can maybe be overwhelming of when am I going to have time to do all of this? And I think you got to keep in mind that we all have the same number of hours in the day. And I often think about that. I'm like, well, what have I done with my life compared to this person who's had the same number of years and hours in their day and they seem to be so much more successful or whatever. So, but we have to manage that and be intentional about it. So big admonishment to myself there of don't get so busy that you forget to lead well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate that conversation about leading versus managing. I think we have a lot there that we can reflect on and improve in 2026. And, I think that's one of my big focuses for next year is how do we take the next step? What is the next step? How do we get there? What do we need to get there? That kind of thing.
Yep. And don't be afraid to dream. I mean, that's kind of the cool thing about doing the leading is you're casting that vision for the future and a reality that doesn't exist yet. And we can fill a gap or a void in the marketplace with what we do or how we do it. And what do we want that to look like as law firm owners? And that's just a really neat thing and a privilege that we have being in the position we are. And that's, again, why we have the podcast, so we can help share what we're learning with others who may be just a few steps behind or maybe just getting started. And so, Thomas, where can people go find out more about building the practice and leaving a legacy?
We've got a lot of videos on youtube.com. Go search for Lifetime Legacy Lawyer Podcast. You'll find us on YouTube, and you'll have a bunch of material that you can look at, a bunch of content that you can view, and then also check us out on anywhere you get your podcasts, and subscribe to the podcast so that you can continue to get this information.
Well, Thomas, thanks as always for the time. I'm looking forward to the next couple podcasts over the next couple of weeks. Talk about some year-end stuff and some financial concepts and planning and different things, and get those topics in place as we close out our end of year and get ready for next year.
Looking forward to it. Thank you, Seth.